He called her honey and told her to find a real Marine. But a battle-hardened Navy SEAL saw the truth hidden in her file. What he did next would shatter the armory's silence forever. The rhythmic slosh of gray water and the squeak of the mop head were the soundtrack to Corporal Riley Vance's life. At 30, her ash-blonde hair was pulled into a severe regulation bun, a few stray strands escaping to frame a face that had seen too much sun and too little sleep. Here, in the cavernous main armory of Fort Briggs, she was a ghost. Her utility uniform, faded and featureless, bore no ribbons, no hint of the woman she had been. She was just a maintenance worker, the one who made the floors gleam before the real warriors arrived. She moved with a practiced, almost mechanical grace between racks of rifles and stations humming with pre-mission energy. Marines, loud and vital, bustled past her, their conversations about firing ranges and deployment schedules flowing around her as if she were a piece of furniture. They didn't see her. They saw the mop, the bucket, the anonymous figure ensuring their workspace was clean. This invisibility was a heavy cloak she'd worn for 6 long months, a penance for injuries that had pulled her from the only world where she'd ever truly felt alive. Her mind drifted back to a small, Rust Belt town in Ohio, to the steely resolve that had propelled her out of a dead-end future and into a recruiter's office. Her grandfather's stories of brotherhood in Vietnam weren't just stories. They were a promise of purpose. She had found that purpose, soaked in the blood and dust of Afghanistan. She had been a combat medic, a doc, a title she cherished more than her own name. A sudden, sharp clang of a dropped ammo cajolted her, and for a split second, the scent of gun oil and stale coffee was replaced by something else. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. Helmand Province. The deafening roar of the IED. The world dissolving into a maelstrom of fire, smoke, and the screams of her brothers. The air, thick with the taste of hot metal and cordite, had choked her as she'd scrambled from the wreckage of the MRAP. Her squad was pinned down, enemy fire raining from the unforgiving hills. She remembered the crawl, the first of 3, the frantic prayer under her breath as bullets kicked up dirt inches from her face. She reached the first man, his leg a ruin of flesh and bone, and began to work, her hands steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She dragged him to the fragile cover of a ditch. Then she went back. The second time, shrapnel tore into her left shoulder, a searing, white-hot pain. She ignored it. She reached another Marine, his breathing shallow, and pulled him back. The third time, a bullet grazed her ribs, stealing her breath and leaving a trail of fire. But she saved 4 men that day. For husbands, sons, and fathers who went home because she refused to. The Purple Heart and the Bronze Star with valor that followed were confirmations of a truth she already knew. She had done her duty. But the real reward was their lives. Her injuries, however, and the quiet, insidious tendrils of PTSD had relegated her to this. To non-combat duties. To mops and buckets. To silence. She believed every job mattered. She told herself that every single day. But standing here, invisible in the heart of the Corps, courage felt like a ghost haunting her past. The supply depot was its own little kingdom within the armory, ruled by Sergeant Miller. Riley watched from a distance as he served a young, male private first class. Miller was all smiles and efficiency, leaning over the counter with a friendly slap on the soldier's back. "There you go, motivator. Give him hell out there," he'd said, his voice oozing camaraderie. The PFC grinned and walked away, his requisition form filled without a second glance. Riley took a deep breath, the familiar scent of bleach from her bucket doing little to calm the knot in her stomach. This was the part of her week she dreaded. She approached the counter as the PFC left, placing her standard request form for cleaning supplies on the worn laminate surface. The change in atmosphere was instantaneous and absolute. Sergeant Miller's smile didn't just fade, it curdled. He straightened up slowly, his eyes sweeping over her maintenance uniform with a look of profound disinterest. He had a perpetually shiny, slightly pudgy face and a uniform so starched it looked like it had never seen a speck of dust. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the form, picking it up as if it were something soiled. His eyes, small and hard, scanned the paper with a theatrical slowness designed to communicate her insignificance. He held it by the very corner, his fingers barely touching it. He hummed a tuneless, irritating melody under his breath. The seconds stretched, each one a small, deliberate act of humiliation. He was making her wait. He was making her stand there, a supplicant for toilet bowl cleaner and floor wax, while he asserted his petty dominance. Finally, he looked up, but his gaze landed somewhere over her shoulder. "Facilities maintenance," he stated, not as a question, but as an indictment. The air crackled with his unspoken judgment. In his world, there were two kinds of Marines, those who fought and those who served those who fought. And in his eyes, Riley Vance was nothing more than a help. The wall of his arrogance was invisible, but as solid as blast-proof concrete. "Listen, honey," Miller began, the condescending term of endearment slicing through the air. He leaned forward, his voice just loud enough for the nearby Marines to hear. "Why don't you go find one of the real Marines to sign this for you? I'm a little busy for this." Heat flooded Riley's cheeks. "I'm a Marine, Sergeant," she said, her voice tight but level. "And I have authorization." Miller let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a sound of humor. It was a weapon. "Pushing a mop doesn't make you a Marine, sweetheart. It makes you a janitor. Maybe you should stick to women's work instead of wasting my time." He gestured vaguely at her form. "This is for war fighters." The words struck her with more force than any physical blow. Around them, conversations faltered. A few Marines pretended to be intensely interested in their gear, but their ears were tuned in. Others shuffled their feet, their refusal to meet her eyes a form of silent complicity. One of Miller's cronies, a corporal leaning against a nearby supply cage, let out a low snicker. The sound amplified her isolation, turning her humiliation into a public spectacle. Her mind reeled. She could taste the dust and blood of Hellman, feel the weight of a dying brother in her arms. She had faced down machine gun fire, and yet she stood here, speechless, being dismantled by a man whose only battles were fought over inventory sheets. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. The folded Purple Heart citation in her back pocket felt like a block of ice against her skin. It was a testament to her sacrifice, a secret she carried every day, but in this moment, it felt like a punchline to a cruel joke. "I just need the supplies to do my job," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Your job?" Miller scoffed, his voice rising in pitch. He was enjoying this now, feeding off the attention. "Your job is to stay out of the way. Maybe you'd be more suited for something in food service. Or laundry." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to strip away her identity, her service, her worth. She stood frozen, trapped in a spotlight of shame, surrounded by men in the same uniform who did nothing. The worst part wasn't the insult itself. It was the silence of her brothers. It was the crushing realization that in their eyes, she had already been demoted from warrior to worker. The breaking point arrived with a final, venomous suggestion for Miller. "Or maybe," he said, leaning in conspiratorially, "you could find a different kind of service to be useful, if you know what I mean." The disgusting implication hung in the air like poison gas. A collective intake of breath rippled through the onlookers. The crony's snicker died in his throat. This had crossed a line, even for them. But still no one moved. Except one. Senior Chief Alex Thorne of the United States Navy SEALs had been quietly observing the entire exchange from a corner of the depot, his face carved from granite, his eyes missing nothing. He'd been reviewing dive logs, but his attention had shifted, his jaw tightening with every escalating insult. Now he moved. He didn't rush. His movements were deliberate, economical, and radiated an authority that silenced the room more effectively than a shout. The sound of his tactical boots on the concrete was a slow, heavy drumbeat of impending judgment. He walked directly to the counter, ignoring Miller completely. His gaze was fixed on the floor. With a grace that seemed impossible for a man his size, he knelt down. Miller had just torn Riley's requisition form in two and let the pieces flutter to the ground. Thorne began to pick them up. One by one, he collected every single piece of paper, his large, calloused hands treating the scraps like sacred artifacts. "What do you think you're doing, Chief?" Miller stammered, his arrogance finally faltering in the face of this silent, unnerving ritual. Thorne rose to his full height, his presence seeming to suck all the air out of the room. He looked directly at Miller for the first time, and Miller physically flinched. "I'm picking up the request of a U.S. Marine you just disrespected," Thorne said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. While watching the confrontation unfold, he had quietly pulled up Riley's service record on his phone. "You think she pushes a mop?" Thorne continued, his voice resonating through the dead-silent armory. "I'll tell you what she's done." He held up the torn pieces of paper. "This is Corporal Riley Vance. On her second tour in Afghanistan, her convoy was struck by an IED. While under sustained enemy fire, she left cover 3 separate times to render aid and drag wounded Marines to safety. He took a step closer to the counter. She saved 4 lives that day. She took shrapnel to her shoulder and a bullet to the ribs, and she kept going. For these actions, she was awarded the Bronze Star Medal with a V for Valor. He let that hang in the air. She was also awarded the Purple Heart. She has bled for this Corps. For you." A wave of shock and shame washed over the faces of the assembled Marines. Miller's face was a mask of pale, clammy horror. Then came the moment that would become legend at Fort Briggs. Thorne unslung his own weapon, a highly customized 18 Malawian Quachas rifle, the sacred tool of his trade. He held it out, presenting it to Riley with both hands in a gesture of profound respect. He stepped back, turning his body to address the entire room. His voice was clear and unwavering. "A warrior of your caliber deserves to carry this, not a mop." He looked directly at Riley, his eyes conveying a universe of understanding. "Show them." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where sound and motion ceased to exist. For a long, breathless moment, the only thing that moved was the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, slanting through the high windows. Riley's hands, trembling, rose to accept the rifle. The cold, familiar weight of the weapon was an anchor, a jolt of electricity that shot through her soul. It felt like coming home. Then, the silence shattered. It wasn't a loud noise, but a cascade of quiet, shame-filled sounds. A sharp exhale from a Marine in the back. The scuff of a boot as someone shifted uncomfortably. A muttered, "Oh my God." Miller, behind his counter, looked like he was going to be sick. His face had gone from pale to a sickly green. He fumbled with a new requisition form, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the pen. I didn't know," he stammered, the words hollow and meaningless. "Corporal, I can get you whatever you need. Right away." Riley didn't even look at him. Her eyes were locked with Thorne's, a silent communion passing between the Navy SEAL and the Marine Corporal. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a deep, unwavering respect. For the first time in months, she felt seen. A young Lance Corporal, the same one Miller had been so friendly with earlier, pushed his way through the crowd. He stopped in front of Riley, his face flushed with shame. "Corporal Vance," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I should have said something. That was not right." He couldn't meet her eyes, staring instead at the floor. One by one, others followed, offering quiet apologies, their words a balm on a wound that had been festering for months. The wall of silence had crumbled, replaced by a wave of remorse. News of the incident spread through Fort Briggs with the speed of a wildfire. It traveled through text messages, hushed conversations in the Chow Hall, and official channels. Within an hour, Riley's phone buzzed. It was her old company commander from her last deployment. "Riley, I just heard. You okay? Anything you need, you call me." More calls followed. Battle buddies she hadn't spoken to in a year reached out. The invisible woman was suddenly the most visible Marine on base. The story of a Navy SEAL and the forgotten hero became a cautionary tale, a lesson in humility echoing through every barracks. The leadership of the Corps took notice, and a quiet but serious investigation into the culture of the supply depot began. 3 weeks later, Riley Vance stood not in front of a mop bucket, but a classroom of new Marines, their faces young, eager, and a little scared. She had been reassigned. Her combat experience, once a source of private pain, was now recognized as an invaluable asset. She was an instructor for combat medicine and battlefield tactics. The weight of the 18 Malawian kwaches had been temporary, but the feeling it had restored was permanent. She had returned the rifle to Thorne an hour after the incident with a simple, handwritten note, "Thank you for seeing me." He had simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their shared warrior ethos. They met for coffee once before he deployed again. They didn't talk about the armory. They talked about the ache of coming home, the ghosts they carried, and the unbreakable bond of service. Standing before her class, Riley was no longer invisible. She was a mentor, a leader, her voice steady and confident as she shared the hard-won wisdom that only comes from walking through fire. She taught them how to apply a tourniquet under pressure, how to stay calm when chaos reigns, and most importantly, how to look out for the Marines standing next to them, no matter their job title. The incident at the armory became a catalyst for change at Fort Briggs. Senior leadership implemented new programs to recognize the diverse service records of all personnel. Respect wasn't just a word in a manual anymore. It was a practice reinforced from the top down. Sergeant Miller was formally counseled and reassigned to a position with no authority over other Marines. Riley found her purpose again, not in the adrenaline of combat, but in the quiet satisfaction of shaping the next generation. She realized her value was never diminished, only overlooked. It took one person with the moral courage to speak up and remind everyone that a warrior's heart doesn't stop beating just because they're no longer on the front lines. What does true respect mean in a world obsessed with titles and appearances? Share your thoughts below, and always comment with respect. For more stories that honor real heroes, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.